Well, thank you very much. It's really a great honor and privilege to be here, especially with this panel and getting into this discussion about a life of the mind for the life of the world. The student governing body asked if I might just say a few words just about Jesuit education in light of this as a way to kind of bring us into the conversation. And I really am taken by this year's panel's theme, a life of the mind for the world. When Pope Francis was first elected to the papacy, I was privileged enough to be in a room where he was with a bunch of Jesuits talking about Jesuit education. And he says, someone finally just said, okay, Holy Father, if you, in a nutshell, what is Jesuit education? And I think we could say any good Christian, any good Catholic education. And he said this, he said, it is nurturing a magnanimous heart and putting it at the service of one's intellect. And then he said, secondly, because if you have a small heart or a selfish heart, a heart that doesn't see the bigger things, is not filled with generosity, you will not have a great mind. You will think bad things. You will actually have a hardened head as much as a hardened heart. So I always thought that that was an interesting way to think about what we're talking about in terms of the life of the mind, how it's attached to the heart, how it's attached truly to human dignity, to the human-centeredness of our lives. I think that in some ways, that sense of the heart being where we learn, where we engage, what it means to understand love, respect, dignity, that kind of frames how we then think about love, respect, and dignity. So it's my hope that all Catholic education does this, and that in some ways, no matter who we are, we share in that nurturing of a heart, making it larger, expanding it so that we can think great things. And with that, I'm going to go to our panelists then, asking them to speak a little bit. We're going to start with, it's two questions. We're going to go one round of questions, and then we'll go with the second round, okay? And we're going to start with Monsignor Shea, if that's okay. Monsignor Shea, in your view, what does it mean to be a pro-life student on campus today? How do you see that? And how do you, as an administrator and educator, build a culture of life in your environment? And I might just maybe further drill down. What do you think the responsibilities you have to students and students have to you in building up that culture?
Father Bosco, thanks very much. Thanks for that great introduction, reminding us of our Holy Father's words about the importance of education, magnanimity, the training of the mind. And I just want to say before we get going, how very happy I am to be here today at the Cardinal O'Connor Conference. I've admired for a long time the work of Georgetown Right to Life, and the students that I've interacted with in preparation for this conference have that magnanimity of heart. You should be very proud of them as students at this Jesuit university. And I can't believe for them more that here I am I get to be at Georgetown today. I'm not paying tuition to be here. It's really, it's really terrific. And I get to be with two of my heroes. You know, I've been involved in the pro-life movement all my life. From the time when I was involved in pro-life activities at the college level, Professor Helen Alvaré has been a mainstay of the pro-life movement. For a long time, she's been the cheerful, gracious voice and face of the pro-life movement in so many different ways. And through the years, I've admired so much, not just what she says, but the way that she says it, the winsome way in which she carries forward the message of pro-life. And so, Helen, I'm really thrilled to be here with you, really very happy about that. Dr. Ashley Fernandez, of course, is an intellectual giant in the field of bioethics. In fact, he's teaching at the bioethics program at the University of Mary. He teaches a course for our graduate students there, and he does an amazing job. When that came to pass, my assistant, who's a graduate of that bioethics program, came running into my office and said, "You can't believe it, you can't believe it. Ashley Fernandez is going to teach for us." And so the fact that I'd be able to be here with these distinguished people, I think it must be a clerical error or something. I mean, it's really, for me, it's a great joy. The question's a good one. So I'm blessed at the University of Mary with many, many pro-life students, and a lot of them are pro-life because they come to us from strongly pro-life families already. A number of them also are pro-life because of the discourse which happens as a matter of course at a university. And students at that age, you know, Dante in the Convivio talks about that stupor of mind of that particular season of life and how open one is to new ideas and impressions. And so a lot of our students come alive to the pro-life cause in the course of their time. Yesterday was the March for Life here in Washington, D.C. Of course, looking for any opportunity to get out of North Dakota in January, we had 5 buses of students who came down to the March for Life. And I was so proud to march with them. Although we had we had about 1,000 more who were at the North Dakota State Capitol yesterday for the North Dakota March for Life. And so that gives you a sense for the pro-life ethos on the campus of the University of Mary. And I think it goes a long way toward answering your question, in that I think that a Catholic university in particular has a responsibility to foster a pro-life ethos. Of course, a university is meant to be a place for the free exchange of ideas. There's supposed to be a lot of dialogue and discussion on many topics that are happening. But at a Catholic university, there should be no mistake among the teachers, faculty, and staff. The students, faculty, and staff, as to what the guiding vision of the university thinks about issues like abortion and euthanasia and life. At the University of Mary, we're unambiguously pro-life. And I think that that's really important. So the students always know that though they can discuss in any strain these complex and sometimes perplexing questions that arise, including hard cases, including case studies, including all of these different types of things, they know that in the pro-life position and in their advocacy, they're going to be strongly supported by the administration of the University of Mary, and that as we're searching the world for great faculty to entrust them to, these questions matter, that we're looking for that magnanimity of heart that forms the mind. And I'll say just a word about this, and I trust we'll have a chance to talk about it later. I think that a university has a particular responsibility to delve deeply into these questions. It's a natural human tendency, but I think it's been amplified in the last couple of years, that everything should be reduced to political sentiment, such that you get a whole lot of heat, not a whole lot of light. And universities, if they're supposed to be the places, has been said, where the church does her thinking, we ought to bring to bear not just political rhetoric, not just easy sloganing, but we need to bring to bear the full weight of the rich, multifaceted tradition and the philosophical, theological, anthropological insights of the faith upon these questions. And if that's not alive and well at a university, then the temptation to collapse into vapid discourse, which then tears people and character apart, that's going to happen as a matter of course.
Yeah. Thank you. I really like the way you phrased the political climate. It's a lot of heat with not a lot of light. And I do think that that's really the kind of world we do live in. And we live with that on our campuses for sure. Thank you very much. Our next question is to Helen, Professor Alvaré. In your view as a pro-life advocate, as a legal mind and scholar, how do you see the pro-life student in terms of the education of law? And does this require firm political views? And how would you distinguish between political views and this kind of pro-life vision?
I'm going to get to the former part of your question through the latter part. And I too want to thank you for having me here. I worked with Cardinal O'Connor for 10 years. And so it is always a great pleasure to be at something informed by his spirit. He was one of the great minds and hearts. And I'm honored to be with these 2 panelists who bring completely different expertise than mine, and you as well, Father. Thank you so much. So beginning at the end of your question, the question of politics is tricky. I've been in DC for 35 years now. And on the one hand, there are things that you cannot get done unless you work with, in the context of a political party. You have to have friends. They have to be able to count on you. And frankly, you won't be invited to the meetings where the wording of statutes or regulations or who's going to run for office is decided. And that's missing out on an opportunity to shape good law, good regulations, good elected officials. That is not, however, for everybody. And it is not for the, I want to say, faint-hearted or weak of mind. And by weak of mind, I'm not referring to intellect. I'm referring to sort of adherence to the true and the good. It is very easy to get co-opted into a, our side, uber alles politics. There's a kind of energy, triumphalism, beat the other side no matter what, that is just sort of a natural, it walks with politics. So it is for some people, but I really think they have to be spiritually really well formed before they are subject to those kind of temptations. But we do need those people in the room in order to shape the laws, choose the candidates, collect the money, et cetera. That said, I always opted to stay non-political in this arena. And so I refused overtures from White Houses of both political parties to become any kind of appointee or other cooperator. I will cooperate with any party, any candidate who wants me to help them frame a beautiful pro-life message. I don't care what party they're in, I will cooperate with the person who wants to do that. And I believe that there is room for that, and it is a strength that some people ought to bring to the pro-life effort. So in law in particular, the question before us right now, the Supreme Court has before it the single most important opportunity to overrule Roe and Casey since Casey. I fear if they don't do it now, given the makeup of the court, given the arguments that are made, given our experience with abortion, which has been so terribly damaging to the country, to women, to respect for life, that they won't do it anytime soon. Legally speaking, there are a couple of leading questions, and for reasons of time, I'll just deal with two. One is, if we are honest with ourselves about what is in the federal Constitution, can we really say that a Constitution that does not contain speech about abortion in any kind contains a federally protected right, which would supersede all other federal and state laws, to abortion? Can we say that the 14th Amendment that was passed at a time when pro-life laws were sweeping the states, the scientific community had discovered the ova, the events of fertilization, et cetera, had overcome Aristotelian biology about quickening and was now understanding that you had to protect life from when we now knew it began. And these laws were changing. Common law had already protected life from when we knew it was there. Now we have new science. We moved the laws in the middle of the 19th century to meet the science. Can we really say that an amendment passed during a sweeping of pro-life laws, continuing from prior common law that was pro-life, could possibly contain a right to abortion? Can we say with any integrity that a court could find that the right to life, liberty, and property in the 14th Amendment could contain a right to destroy what we all know scientifically is human and alive at any time during pregnancy? There is no integrity to a judicial decision that could say that. That brings me to the second and final point, which is the question of our laws and integrity and truth. And this goes obviously way past the area of abortion. But if a law does not respect what is true about human beings and what is true about human society, it's just bound to wreak havoc in the society, and it's bound to destroy respect for life. So you want to form to the, I do not bring my opinions into a classroom. I teach at a public university. I teach law. I do, however, bring a very expert analysis to what substantive due process, that is 14th Amendment, life, liberty, property rights, should and should not contain based on the history of the Constitution and of our laws. And also, always, whether I'm teaching property law, family law, or First Amendment law, always to teach about what the law, to ask the question, to stir up the dialogue about what the law ought to be if we really are to respect human life at every stage and in every way that it requires respect.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much. And I do think that it's that zero-sum game that we have to kind of we have to kind of make peace with the fact that that's the kind of way we do politics today. And, and you have to somehow either decide how you want to step outside of that to do something else with your mind and to really engage. Thank you so much. Dr. Fernandez, you're in the medical field. So what does it mean to be a pro-life student and educator in terms of medicine today? I know you're a great mentor to many medical students. Do you find most students open to being personally formed in medical education and things like that? What the responsibility for medical students towards dialogue and reflection?
Sure. So I will answer your questions, I promise, but I have to thank everybody for inviting me here. I really feel like if they have those, those kids games, I'm a pediatrician, so let me indulge in little kids games, like which one does not belong here? It's here. So the two panelists in particular are my idols, and I'll tell you a brief story about each one of them. So Professor Alvaré, when I was a grad student, my friend who also went to Georgetown as a grad student, we were doing what grad students do. We were in our, sweatpants and watching TV and eating Chinese food probably at midnight or something like that on C-SPAN. Professor Alvaré was on C-SPAN taking apart the pro-choice arguments, testifying in front of Congress. And we were jumping up, screaming at the TV, shouting. We're like, who is this woman? We can be like this. This is incredible. And just it was a football game, like it was an Ohio State Buckeye game. And so I've idolized Professor Alvaré since I was a grad student. And Monsignor Shea I met later. And when I first started teaching at the University of Mary, I would go there for a seminar. And it was a very, very cold North Dakota evening. And I was talking with the grad students at this bar, this pub they call Chesterton's there. It's the first time I ever met him. Well, Monsignor Shea walks in with this, tall, heavy coat. The collar was covered up. So he was so young. But when he walked in, all the grad students were like, it was like that moment in the Garden of Gethsemane where the soldiers ask, like, who are you? And he says, or which one is Jesus of Nazareth? And he says, it's me. And everybody kind of falls back. Monsignor Shea walks in and all the grad students sort of fall back. And I'm like, who is this young grad student? He didn't even come to my seminar today. And now he walks in, he must be like the stud of the group or whatever. And it turns out he was the president of the university. But what was amazing about it was the relationship that Monsignor Shea had with each and every one of these students, and they knew who he was and he knew them by name. It was, for me as kind of a younger professor of medicine at the time, it was great to see. And so I really appreciated that sort of moment of mentorship. Anyway, I'm happy to be here. To answer your question, I think, let me talk about what I think it means to be a pro-life student. I'll indulge in a brief pediatric analogy, if you will. Remember, for all of you that are listening to this, remember when you think about the bully at school, just think about an image of a bully at school, and then someone stands up to that bully and someone defends that person who has no other defense. And that's a story that everyone has either experienced or thought about as a child. And that really resonates, the person that defends that vulnerable person from something much bigger than them. That's what you are. You are listening to this. You are here at this conference and you're supporting these groups because you are the person who has decided, I am going to combat this gigantic thing that seems like no one else wants to do. And I'm going to do it at great risk to myself. And we understand that. And I appreciate you for taking the time to be at this conference. I think it's really important that the pro-life student understand what they are doing is not a hobby. It's something very serious. It's something very moral. And it's something absolutely good. What you are doing in even supporting this conference is so good. And it gives me such a warm feeling, such an optimistic feeling as a teacher and educator and as a physician, especially for those listening that might be going into medicine. It is a great thing that you're doing. I want to also say that, there's a poet, Ovid, and if I tried to say this in Latin, I would butcher it. So I'm just going to say it in English. But he has there's a very famous poem in which he says, a drop of water hollows out stone, not by blunt force, but by persistence. Okay. A drop of water hollows out stone, not by blunt force, but by persistence. And I think that's, as a pro-life student, that is how you have to see yourself. You don't necessarily have to come at people with this sort of blunt force, but Stay in the game, stay in there, be there. And this drip, 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 this truth that we know is real will affect people and will work its way down and crumble this wall that people have built up over these last 40 years and beyond. Let me say one last thing about the student, the pro-life student, which is this. If you don't know your role yet, and if you don't know, well, what, I know I'm pro-life and I know that I believe this, what you believe is true. And if the saints of the church have taught us anything, the way people reach God is by different means. Not everybody is a John the Baptist. Not everybody becomes a saint by going out and preaching and hammering on tables or giving lectures. And there are many saints who have had a contemplative approach and just prayed for other people. And there are saints who are doctors like Saint Gianna, who have gone out and become saints through their work in the world. So if you haven't found your path, realize the example of the saints shows us that there are many different paths in which you can help the pro-life movement, in which you can be a pro-life student. You don't have to pick one. If you feel like you're talented in writing but not speaking, do that. But realize that what you're doing is absolutely good, and it is for that most vulnerable human being and the most vulnerable human beings. And I don't even think I got to your second question, but we'll go with that for now.
That's fine. No, that's great. Thank you. Thank you very much. It really kind of then moves to that the question of what we do as an administrator of a college and with a graduate school. What do we do as a law professor, as a medical professor? This idea of dialogue. How do we dialogue in this kind of zero-sum game world that's outside, perhaps, of the university, and perhaps even inside the university in certain places? And so we go with you again, Monsignor Shea. How do you see the importance of fostering engagement in pro-life dialogue at the university level? Is there ways that you can equip students to engage the diverse opinions and perspectives?
Well, Father, what I think I'd say is that I take your question even further and say that a university is meant to be a place where this very thing can happen. Because what I think is so often lost in the discourse about abortion and related questions in our culture are the deep first principles that undergird the various positions that are taken on this question. And universities are meant to be a place where people can not just go broad, but can go very deep into these particular questions. I mean, claims like every human being has inherent worth and should be treated with dignity,
right.
Or that in the most important things, human beings share fundamental equality and should be treated with equal respect. These are claims that are widely held in our society, even if they're not well practiced. And they're treated as self-evident first principles. But when you look at them from an historical point of view, you realize that they're not at all self-evident, that we don't appear to be equal, and that in the vast majority of human history, people haven't been treated with dignity. What civilizations or peoples of the ancient world held to these supposedly self-evident claims? None of them, so far as we can see, with the exception of Israel. And so we have, I think, the benefit of the long influence in teaching of Christianity to thank for these beautiful principles, but we have to deeply ground ourselves in them. And I say this to our students all the time, that we have to be clear about what the sources of our claims and our convictions really are. Otherwise, if we're not examining them, they won't have the strength to hold up against clear examination or against the greed and the pride of a fallen world, And so as we think about that, we realize as well that when we're talking about legalized abortion in this country and the legacy, as Helen was saying, of Roe and Casey, we're not just talking about what might be sort of a very natural human impulse to discard children who are inconvenient. That's been a constant part of the human experience. We're talking about a moral vision which doesn't simply hold this up as something which should be sort of tolerated, an unfortunate bad thing, but really as a good and important cause on behalf of autonomy. And so as we look at the philosophical and anthropological assumptions at the basis of legalized abortion, we see obviously the struggle for sexual liberation, but it goes deeper than that. It goes to this idea that human beings don't belong to each other. Remember, Mother Teresa said, if we have no peace, it's because we've forgotten that we belong to each other. Bishop Daniel Flores of Brownsville came up and gave a talk on our campus a few years ago and he was talking about immigration in this respect and then relating it to all the other issues. And he said that we've so hollowed out our sense of common purpose and the good that all that's left for us is a network of willed relations in which it's so easy to say, you have nothing to do with me. And it's not simply enough for us at a Catholic university to encourage our students to gravitate against that sentiment, but also to give them the intellectual ballast necessary to say, you know what, when Justice Kennedy writes in Casey that at the root of the purpose or the meaning of existence is being able to define one's own purpose and sense of the meaning of life. Is that really true? Or is there something deeper that human beings believe about the meaning and purpose of human life? And so I think that it's really important for us to get to the heart of these issues, because pro-life and pro-abortion people are all, the most convicted of them are all intelligent and tempted to think that their opponents are stupid. But it's not true. Actually, it's a question of operating from very different starting points. And to examine those gets to the real heart of the matter. And then we're talking at the level that universities should be having these conversations.
Thanks, Monsignor. It reminds me, I remember when Cardinal Dolan was here, I was last year, I mean, the COVID fog, was that last year, 2 years ago? But he talked about the need for to go back to a human anthropology, that's what we can do. And it all starts there. And just naming what Kennedy said in the court, it just showed a kind of a very, truncated understanding of what it means to be human and what the desire and the hunger for our lives is to be, just to be free, just to make our own decisions. That's all, So I appreciate that very much. Dr. Alvaré, we're going to move to you then. The same kind of question: How do you approach legal education? How do you promote dialogue in legal settings, particularly in a law school? And what do you think are there any ethical responsibilities with which individuals engaging in dialogue have towards one another?
So yeah, you had previewed these questions. How do I approach legal education? And it's like, how much time do I have? And so I thought I'm going to boil it down, which is, while I operate and believe in Catholic social teaching about us belonging to one another, Benedict's Deus Caritas Est, giving every person that look of love they crave, is just so important. I remain absolutely appalled at what I see as a lack of dialogue around this area so often. When I was at the other state university in Ohio once, I was on a panel of women that was to talk about these issues. And I guess one of the speakers hadn't really looked at my background. She's now a very prominent, of course, editorial writer for the New York Times. And when I got up to give my talk, she had a physical and verbal and just freak out meltdown that and basically said something like, how are people like you allowed, out of the house? Why is this a question? This is not a question. This is not an intellectual question. You are engaging something that is beyond dispute. I had the Center for Reproductive Law and Policy, which I think is at Columbia, that trains up professors who are very, very hardcore pro-choice to go out and populate law schools. I was on a panel with her about a similar topic, and she said basically, opinions like yours, she said, and I'm almost quoting, opinions like yours should not be permitted in the public square. And I sort of sat back and said, I think I win. I don't think I have to say anything else here, because I like dialogue and you don't, and I think that wins. But so frankly, even to say that there can be dialogue about these issues, and this isn't the only one, is itself a major step forward. That's my first thing. I can't tell you how many television programs, congressional panels, academic programs where it's me against five. You know, I'd go on the Diane Rehm show. It would be Diane, two other people versus me. I would do the hardball. It would be Chris Matthews, three other people against me. And NPR, it was always more than three against one. So dialogue was not really a value out there. So for us to begin by valuing dialogue is a beautiful thing. Second, I experienced and still experience in my career, not a complete enough, I'm trying to put this so charitably, not a complete enough willingness to work with facts and good scientific evidence in the debate over abortion. And in fact, if one looks at my amicus briefs on these questions or on questions of religious freedom, they'll make you crazy because it's all footnotes. And the footnotes are usually to people that my opponents will agree are credible scientific sources. So it's all the CDC and the WHO and the Guttmacher Institute and the leading medical journals and the leading international journals in order to say, listen, using evidence that I think, can both agree on, it leads to this conclusion. What I'm proposing here is, I'm a huge believer in good empirical data, in the credibility of the sources and in using credible sources. And I always say, and people are getting tired of hearing this mantra of mine, but it is a career-long one, that if you are going to be a pro-life advocate in law, in medicine, in ethics, in philosophy, in anything, you have to be the best prepared person in the room. This is not just a place for very good souls to do a good service. It is Etienne Gilson's intelligence in the service of Christ. It's do your homework, it's stay up all night, it's be excruciating in terms of the level of your research. And don't enter a dialogue without it. And then finally, when you do enter that dialogue, set the terms with your preliminary statements and say, I know that we want this to be peaceful. I know that we want it to be intellectually sound. I know that we want to be proud of ourselves on this. I know that we want to give a good example as academics, with students, with other academics, to the public, whomever we're speaking to. And I usually say that in front. It's a kind of a communication stick that this is how I know we want to behave. And therefore, I'm going to do the following in order to satisfy those terms. And you've now set the bar. And it's dialogue, but it's dialogue with a little bit of hard-earned wisdom about how low it can go on this debate.
Yeah. Truly, and this idea of people say they want a dialogue, but they don't really want to dialogue, right?
Very
and so,
often.
yeah, so it really, and especially as it gets down into sound bites as well. Thank you, Helen. And then we're gonna. Oh, please.
Could I interrupt just for a moment? I appreciate everything that Helen said, but I want to add something, and it's to her. It's part of her technique, I think, as well, in that all of the things that she said she practices, but there's this other thing, and she models it so well, but I think all of us need to as well. She's indomitably cheerful in her approach. It's really amazing. You know, so Dr. Fernandez talked about watching her on C-SPAN. I was sitting in seminary once, and we were watching her on television, and I was sitting with a simple guy from Kentucky, and we were watching this debate together. And during the whole thing, Helen didn't get a single sentence out. She would start talking, and somebody would shout her down. And at the end, he turned to me, and she left. She just smiled, and she was so warm. And he turned to me and he said, "I've never been so proud to be a pro-lifer." And she hadn't said anything. The whole thing, it was amazing. And that's so important for us, because in the end, we know that we cleave to the cross of Jesus Christ, and that this cause is not just our cause. And so it's not something for us just to be defensive about, but to be really cheerful warriors about it.
And I remember that debate. I actually ordered the transcript because I was sure that I had never, I mean, they sliced into silk, and it was, and it was all sliced up, and I was so mortified, but at the same time, I never got more nice letters from people because I was like, I tried and I didn't get mean, and they're just going to have to put up with that. But I actually own the transcript of that debate. Yeah. Anyway, thank you.
Fantastic. Dr. Fernandez, how do you engage in dialogue surrounding pro-life debates in the field of bioethics with some of your other colleagues? What are your strategies? And do you see room for disagreement or agreement in there?
Yeah, I think you have to have it. I would just say that, in medicine, dialogue is the fundamental basis of the doctor-patient relationship. And how does that work? How do we actually heal people? All the pharmacological tools and techniques that you use don't hold a candle to actually making a connection with a person. When they trust you and when you can have a dialogue with another person and connect with that person, it makes a huge difference in the ability to heal. That being said, when you're talking about dialogue in the pro-life movement, it's amazing that we have to sit here as a group and talk about fighting for dialogue. And I want people to think about that. Like the dialogue is something that is so important, not just because we have this issue of being pro-life and trying to get it out, but it's what's at stake because of the dialogue. Just like in medicine, if you don't have that doctor-patient relationship, well, what happens? Well, then it's the person who suffers. The real loss is for the person who suffers. In this case, dialogue is critical, not because we're in the right, which we are, and because it is something that we have a right to, certainly as human beings and in intellectual environments or university environments. But it is because if we are not allowed or permitted to exchange ideas with other people, it is the most vulnerable people that suffer. What we do is right. The pro-life movement is right. I've never been more convinced of anything. We're right on the medicine. We're right on the hardcore science. We're right on the moral philosophy. We're right on the theology, if you believe in that. But if you don't, we have the other three. We're right. So then the question is, if people are not willing to listen, and Professor Alvaré's stories are evidence of this. Why don't they want dialogue? It is because they cannot permit that light to be seen. Why? Because if they do, if you allow that dialogue to proceed, they know that they will lose that battle. And so I want to say dialogue is the first step, but it's the first step because you move forward from there. Once we are able to articulate what our position is, people will gravitate to that position. And so I think I work in a secular university. I teach medical students and residents, and I don't ever once have to mention, nor would I, because it's not the forum for it. I don't have to mention my faith, but my faith animates the things that I do. And I want students to understand who are watching this, you don't have to abandon your faith because you work in a secular environment, or which is what the world wants you to do, and they want it for a reason. So I guess I would say, first of all, to be holy. So to engage in dialogue, I think you really need to have the desire to be holy, to pray every day, to work on your spiritual formation. God has granted everybody who's watching this with intellectual gifts. Your parents did through genetics, but the holiness has to be cultivated. It has to be intentionally nurtured. And we forget that sometimes because dialogue and winning an argument can become a game, but it's be holy. The second thing is be excellent at what you do. And these two panelists with me and you, Father Bosco, I mean, you're examples of this in your daily life. Be excellent at what you do. And this echoes what Helen was saying. If I'm a pediatrician, which I am, I have to be the best clinician I can possibly be. I have to study hard. I have to make sure I understand pediatrics. I understand everything that I need to know for medical, clinical decision-making. And then I would say third is be kind or be charming or be, joyful, because that's really important just as a human person to engage with another person in dialogue is to be as kind as you can. And also to realize that people that are ardently pro-choice are lost. They're still children of Christ. They're just lost sheep. They're the one sheep that strayed from the 99. And we owe them that kindness. And then I would say the last thing is to be prepared to move forward. You know, there's this phrase in Latin, plus ultra, which I know some of you have heard of, to move beyond, to go beyond what you can see, to realize the dialogue is only the beginning. Once you have that desire to see the horizon and think to yourself, I need to go beyond even what I can see. My desire is to go beyond this. Yes, we hopefully Roe versus Wade will be overturned, but think plus ultra, what's beyond the horizon? What's beyond this? And to think about that. Now think about those 4 things: to be holy, to be excellent at what you do, to be kind, and to be prepared to go beyond where you stand. If you're missing one of those 4 things, you're not going to engage in the most effective dialogue on the most important issue that we have in our time.
Yeah, thanks. And it is true that that faith is we have such a misconstrued our suspicion that faith somehow lessens the human heart. But it is faith that makes it a generous heart. It's faith that makes us kind. It's faith that makes us see the other as a human being, no matter what that other looks like. So I really appreciate that, Doctor. In fact, the kind of the last question before we take the Q&A from our students was about strategies. And you just kind of all have given a kind of a strategy for dialogue. So maybe we'll turn it around to that final question. What can attendees of this conference take away and bring to the rest of the world? If you were just to say, what is the what's next for them, for this group of students, their generation in the years ahead? We'll start with you, Monsignor.
Yeah, so I was inspired just now by Dr. Fernandez's answer, you know, what's beyond, going beyond. And a question occurs to me, which I think should be very alive in the heart of any pro-life college student right now, and all of us in the movement, really. Are we ready for a pro-Roe world? Are we really ready for it? Because the implications of that are really great in terms of all of our energies have been gathered through the years around the evident injustice, the tremendous misery and pain and brokenness unleashed upon our country by this jurisprudence, and it has left our country on this issue profoundly fractured. And so are we ready if things go the way that we're praying and hoping and fasting that they go with Dobbs? And I do think, Helen, that when we think about the circumstances right now, if not now, when? It's really, this is high stakes stuff. But if Roe versus Wade is overturned and the question goes back to the states, I was reading this morning that there are groups in California that are mobilizing to fly women to California as a sanctuary place for abortion to happen, paying for travel, paying for the procedure itself, paying for lodging and aftercare, et cetera. That's the claim that's being made. When the Holy Father talks about magnanimity, this is a great question for all of us in the movement. If we're ready to put our lives, our resources, and our comfort on the line to make sure that in a post-Roe world, we are demonstrating the profound charity, the love, the true convictions of pro-life people in that way. And I'd say this to the college students who are listening to us: we have to do that and mobilize in just that way, no matter what happens in June. No matter what happens in June, this is a question which should be alive in our hearts. And indeed, I have seen in the course of my involvement in the pro-life movement a shift in tone. In other words, the March for Life has gotten more joyful, more prayerful, year after year after year, leading up to this high stakes march of yesterday, in which I was just profoundly edified. And there were very few counter protesters out there. I was shocked by that. I told our students in a packed church beforehand, I thought they would be out in force. And I said, here's how you respond. here's how you guard your hearts and your minds in the midst. But my words were a little wasted in that there just wasn't much there. But I think we have to give a lot of thought and prayer in a robust way to what a post-Roe country looks like and what our responsibility is as sentinels of love in the midst of this question.
Helen?
Excuse me, thank you very much, because I have to have it momentarily. So obviously, the question of our services continuing and expanding to women in crisis pregnancies, and the pro-life movement has pioneered that. We have thousands. We always need more. I can't tell you, again, you can see I'm a little bit of a fighter. The accusation that pro-life, quote, didn't care about the person after they're born, and when I think about anything, Catholic Relief Services, Catholic Charities, when I think about this thousands of crisis pregnancy homes, it always struck me as such a great irony, because the advocates of legal abortion have none of this for people. And yet the accusation was always made, and the pro-life movement was put on the defensive. So yes, we have to do more of that. But there's something, because I know this won't so often be touched upon, that I want to highlight in addition to that very obvious thing, is so long as people are pregnant in circumstances in which they feel their life cannot admit of child rearing, abortion will be sought. And we know this. And this is how the abortion issue is never a single issue. It's never just about, this is a human life, why would you not respect it? Why can we not help you respect it? Why don't you see that you ought to respect it? It's also always, this whole abortion issue, the question of what is the role of a child in a woman's life? What is the meaning of the fact that the woman is pregnant, that the woman gives birth? What is the meaning of the fact that God could have brought new human lives about in any way? They could have grown in fields, they could have been from just one sex, we could have had them handed down one by God himself. And yet it's at the intersection of the man and the woman in an act that's been called love, for a long time. And the child is needy and needs the care of both. And the father really prefers paternal certainty. And the mother, 86% of single parent homes are run by mothers. The mother is inclined to do that care. This has been said from Aristotle to Aquinas to the later scholastics to canon law to today, building on nature what our teaching is. So this is the fact, and yet we have divorced from the idea of love, the idea of tomorrow, and the idea of procreation, that the child is the living embodiment of tomorrow. And so long as the notion of sex is separated from the idea of tomorrow, which means it's separated from kin and future and family, we're going to have lots of people pregnant in situations where they do not feel that they can easily accept a child. So to me, the third rail, the discussion about sex in the context of a commitment to tomorrow, of the male-female relationship being rejuvenated, of understanding this, we're built for one another. Well, the creation of male and female, diverse, equal, unified, procreative, the abortion issue points back to that big time. And unless we address this idea of sex, love, marriage, parenting as a natural and theological unity, we're going to be struggling to take care of as many people as are in crisis in the future. And so I really feel we have to up the quality and quantity and visibility of our speech in this. I'm not plugging the book that's coming out, but I am writing about it in a book that's coming out in 2 months about how the church does this. And I feel very strongly that that is the plus ultra. That's the next thing, is what I think we have to speak about too.
Thank you, Helen. Dr. Fernandez, we're gonna go to Q&A, but maybe you can find your, some response in there. So are there questions and answers coming from the? Thank you. So these were from students who are watching it. First one, and I'm just going to open it up to, and maybe we'll ask, maybe if you want to start, Dr. Fernandez. While fostering spaces for pro-lifers is important, how do we reach the 50% of Catholics and other religious denominations that are pro-choice? And what factor, angles, and style do you use in order to change someone's mind in that place?
That's an easy one. So
Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Fernandez.
Well, I think that for the Catholics that are consider themselves pro-choice, I think that's a shame, because again, we have this richness in our church and a very consistent and beautiful message that is consistent not just in theology but in moral philosophy and in the sciences, and we have constantly proclaimed that. And then for other Protestant denominations, I think we try to unite them around our constant belief and our consistent belief and love of Jesus Christ, and that the human person is made in Jesus's image, and that becomes sanctified through that. If they have that common basis of faith, I believe that there is a way to reach them, because if they're truly religious, they believe in something transcendent, something that goes beyond our material selves. In medicine, that's the challenge of being a doctor nowadays and being trained as a doctor, as a scientist, is there's a real materialism that has sort of invaded the discipline, which is to say that nothing is real that exists outside of the empirical. And it's a temptation. You can get very caught in that kind of training, that your value is your random collection of atoms that were here by accident. When you die, you become worm food. And so you can see how, if you believe that materialist premise, your choice becomes the ultimate thing of value. That is to say, your neurons produce this through these complex neurochemical reactions, this thing, which is your choice. And if someone says you can't do this, that's an affront to your dignity. Your dignity becomes your autonomy, because that's all the reality that there is. On the other hand, people of faith believe that there is something outside yourself which gives you value and which gives us value, which cannot be touched, no matter how degraded your molecules or atoms are. And I think to answer this question, at least with respect to people of faith, is to remind people of the dignity and value of the human person that cannot be touched by illness or sickness, or what you can do or what you're supposed to do or what you haven't done or what your stage of development is. What gives that unborn child value has nothing to do with its molecules per se, except that they are created by the same God. And I guess I would just say that is the it's going to be amazing to me when Roe versus Wade is overturned, because what I'm hoping the next stage, to answer the previous question, would be that through the smallest of things, through the unborn child, we start to transform all of our society, to make it a place where human dignity is upheld, not just at the beginning of life, but then at the end of life and everywhere in between, that our human sexuality is respected, that the children that don't have health care and live in abject poverty, that their dignity is upheld as well. But it'll be perhaps through the lens of saving the unborn child that we understand what it takes to have a truly pro-life society.
You know, if I can respond myself, I've talked to Catholics who say they're pro-choice, and it seems to come down, anecdotally, of course, but it seems to come that it's just the way that they structure the values of their faith, that they don't value that life as much. And so there's a sense of disordered values, and in some ways, a very Ignatian way to talk perhaps about it. And this idea that, but what about justice for the women? What justice for the poor woman? So there's this sense that they've caught something within faith, but it's disordered to the greater value, which is that this is a human life that needs dignity. And having that discussion is such a difficult thing, because it's where you plant yourself in your place in faith. Does anybody else want to respond to that as well?
I'm so moved by your thought that the unborn child, how Christian is that? Something so small to be the beginning, something unseen, something unexpected, something in one little corner of the world, to be the beginning of transforming respect for all these. I'm getting chills. I'm going to think a lot about that. The other thing I want to say about that is, the more you practice your faith, the more you pray, the more spiritual reading you do, the more you go back. I've become a huge fan of the patristics. You know, what were they saying at the beginning of the church? There's this great book on moral theology by Bultmann, von Balthasar, and Benedict. It's a little primer on moral theology. And they talk about a time in the Christian history when we were being very intensely informed by the Holy Spirit and things were forming. It was very palpable that, you know, we were still learning, and we still are, but it was just a very intense period of it. And at that time, the radicality of love in Christianity, that the fathers of the church, Chrysostom, Augustine, others, who were preaching, really like taunting the Christians about, what do you mean you're not opening your heart and your home and your pocketbooks to the poor? You know, the St. Basil, the Basiliad, this new way of living with clergy and the poor and the lay together. The radicality of love led these people, the same ones who were wagging their fingers about the necessity of taking care of those vulnerable, were the people who were speaking the most clearly about no abortion, no infanticide, no leaving children out on the hill to die, no polygamy, no divorce, no same-sex relations. They were the same folks. And why? Because the radicality of Christian love is very frightening what it demands. And I always like to say to people that anyone who's even dipping their toe in the water and finding something really attractive about Catholic social teaching on immigration, on poverty, on you know, anything that Pope Francis is doing with respect to the unemployed or the migrants washed up on a shore, should be equally aware that that radicality is what we have in the pro-life movement, and that it's the same thing. And it's a frightening commitment to think of yourself as first in relation, first you owe that. And if that mindset is accepted in any other issue, it should lead you across all of them in Catholic social teaching, including this one. But I just think there's so much to be said about what you started here. So thank you.
Could I just briefly point out, Father Bosco, that what Helen is talking about in terms of renewal in the church, in terms of the radicality of the gospel, in every season of renewal, you notice that it's not just a moral rejuvenation, it's also a new bringing to bear of the intellectual vitality of the church. So when we're talking about the life of the mind, if we're going to have the renewal that's being spoken of, if this revolution of a civilization of love is to arise in an incarnational way, reflecting the way that an unborn child once started history all over again, that it's a matter not simply of an ethical consideration, because I think that pro-choice Christians, both Catholics and non-Catholics, oftentimes have boiled the faith down simply to ethics. And absolutely. So until there's not just that, but a sense of not the academic sense of Christianity, but the intellectual sense and vitality of Christianity, that renewal needs to take place in a full gamut there. Oh, and we have to challenge ourselves to it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we have time for one more question. And the students want to know what writings or influences have been critical for you in your own development as a pro-lifer, and what aspects drew you. Was it an aspect that drew you closer to your current beliefs? But I guess they're looking. It's a college. We want to know what texts we're reading. What are the things that are important to us? That who have we been in conversation with in the intellectual world of Catholicism or beyond in terms of this 2,000-year intellectual history? This is von Balthasar, as mentioned already. No, please.
Oh, you want to go?
No.
I would say, without a doubt, I'm just going to mention one, maybe two, but let me start with one. Jacques Mariton, The Person and the Common Good. I was going to say that before anybody else up here said it. See, I was afraid, so I wanted to go first. But Jacques Mariton, The Person and the Common Good, is an excellent. It's a very, very small. So for all of you busy students out there, I don't have time to read a huge book or whatever. It's a very small, thin book. It's so beautifully written. And let me briefly tell you what it's about. And I'm a physician, and I'm a scientist, and I'm an ethicist, and so it's really a book that sometimes people read in political philosophy, and it briefly says that he's writing in the post-war era. He's a French philosopher. He talks about the importance of the human person and how that is the fundamental unit upon which all of society ought to be based. That society exists for the person, not the other way around. And that taught me something. He's writing in the post-war era. He says, Nazism makes the mistake of putting race above the value of the human person. Communism makes the mistake of putting the state and the state interests above the value of the human person. Even unbridled capitalism can do the same thing if it puts profit before the value of the human person. And if you want to build a political society and a sort of moral society, you have to put the value of the human person above everything else. That's the center around which all other things ought to revolve. Thinking about it from my own vocation in medicine, that has deeply influenced me in my medical practice as well.
Thanks, Dr. Fernandez. We'll have to do this in quick time now because we're just coming to the very end. So the same thing, real quick.
Very briefly. So I was a student in Rome during the pontificate of Pope St. John Paul II. And so his writings shaped me deeply, Evangelium Vitae and others. Father Pellegrino, who I know is a mentor of yours. I have a younger brother who's a priest. I'm the oldest of 8, and I'm a priest. And then number 5 is a priest too. And he was trained as a bioethicist and gave me the writings of Father Pellegrino. I was just so moved by him. And then a little small book that I read when I was, I think, a senior in high school by a Jesuit from Wisconsin, Father John Powell. He wrote a little book called The Abortion Holocaust. And I was very moved by it. I don't remember much of the specifics from an intellectual point, but I remember the dedication of the book. He said the pages of this book are dedicated to every woman who carries a child under her heart, especially if your heart is trembling with fear or gripped by a lonely pain. Know that you're not alone. There's so many who love you. And I know that from an intellectual standpoint, maybe that's not impressive, but it so wounded my heart that it's always been a mainstay for me, that memory of that small book in fortifying my pro-life involvement.
Thank you.
I would say Benedict's Deus Caritas Est on the nature of Christian love. First half talks about eros and agape. The second half is about charity in social and a social manifestation. The other one, Sidney Callahan, who wrote an article on pro-life feminism in Commonweal years ago. Very, very moving. And Father Jim Burchell wrote a book called Rachel Weeping, which is now an older book, but one of the greats. Powell was another one I was going to say, but I think these are some of the 3 greats in pro-life literature.
Thank you. And thanks, panelists, for this, for being with us today, especially with the way that COVID has made us have to do this and stuff like that. And we just really appreciate it. You're an inspiration to so many people. Obviously, here at Georgetown, we're just so grateful to always host this and to bring this together. And we just really want to thank you for your time and for inspiring us to continue the work. So thank you very much, everyone. And I think we will now move to our final, I think to the liturgy, I think comes next.
Hey, great job.